He thought she was a target. She was a diagnostic. He thought it was a fight. It was a calibration. He believed his mass was a weapon, but to her, it was just data. In the end, the mountain of a man who demanded a war learned the hard way that some people are a gravity all their own, and he was simply an object falling into it. Backward. More by operating base. Erebus was a monument to attrition. It was a gravel sore on the bleached skin of the desert, a place where the sun beat down with the percussive malice of a hammer on an anvil. The air itself was a physical presence, thick with pulverized silica and the ghosts of vaporized sweat. It smelled of diesel, hot metal, and the profound, almost spiritual boredom that festers in places where men wait for things to happen. Silence here was never empty. It was a coiled thing, tensed with the whine of distant generators and the ceaseless, abrasive whisper of wind across concertina wire. The mountains on the horizon were not majestic. They were knives, serrated and sterile, cutting the featureless blue of the sky. Inside the perimeter, everything was coated in a fine talc-like dust that muted colors and got into everything. Food, weapons, lungs. It was a world rendered in shades of beige and exhaustion. Within this monochrome existence, the gym was a pocket of desperate vitality. It was not a facility. It was an agglomeration of intent. Housed in a cavernous green canvas tent whose walls rippled and snapped in the wind, it was an assault on the senses. The air was a humid soup, thick with the smell of old sweat, rust, and ozone from a straining power converter that fed a single, wobbling industrial fan. Light bled through the translucent fabric of the roof, creating a diffuse, sickly yellow glow that illuminated dust motes dancing in the air like frantic insects. The floor was a patchwork of black rubber mats, scuffed and scarred from dropped weights and the drag of boot heels. Against one wall, a menagerie of iron plates was stacked on groaning racks, their surfaces filmed with a mixture of chalk dust and grime. A row of heavy bags, patched with duct tape, hung like executed effigies, their chains creaking a rhythmic, metallic lament with every gust of wind that breached the tent's imperfect seams. She stood near the corner, a fixed point in the kinetic chaos. Lieutenant Anya Sharma was an anomaly in this ecosystem of loud, overt physicality. She wore simple gray sweatpants and a plain black t-shirt, devoid of rank or unit insignia. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun. To the casual observer, she was small, almost forgettable, with a stillness that could be mistaken for timidity. But her stillness was not passive. It was the absolute economy of a predator at rest. Her eyes, a dark and startlingly lucid shade of brown, were not merely looking, they were processing. She tracked the movement of a Marine skipping rope, not seeing the exercise but the subtle shift in his center of gravity, the minute imbalance each time his left foot landed, the wasted energy in the tension of his shoulders. She was a human diagnostic engine, perpetually parsing the world into its fundamental components of mass, velocity, and intent. Her current focus was a heavy bag, a 100-pound cylinder of packed fabric and sand. She was not hitting it. She was listening to it. Her fingers traced the scuffed canvas, feeling the subtle divots and compressions left by thousands of impacts. She noted the way it swayed on its chain, not as a single object, but as a complex system. She calculated the pendulum dynamics, the torsional stress on the hanging strap, the way the air displaced around it. In her mind, the bag was a proxy for a human torso. The chain was a spinal column. The sway was the body's reaction to a blow. the transfer of kinetic energy through soft tissue. She could see the shock wave of a hypothetical punch propagating through the material, could map the resulting oscillation, and could predict the precise moment of maximum instability, the perfect window for a follow-up strike. To the others in the tent, she was just a quiet officer staring at a piece of equipment. To herself, she was practicing a form of physics that few understood, and even fewer could survive. The ambient noise of the gym, the grunt and clang of weights, the rhythmic thud of fists on bags, the shouted encouragement, was bisected by a new sound. It was a voice that was not merely loud, but occupied space, a blunt instrument used to hammer the air into submission. "Look at this, boys. Navy's trying to figure out which end of the bag to hit." The voice belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Rex Thorne. Thorne was a man built on a scale that defied subtlety. He was immense, a monolith of muscle that was beginning to surrender to a softer, broader architecture of fat. His neck was a thick column that seemed to merge directly into his traps, and his shaved head sat atop it like a belligerent afterthought. He moved with the lumbering confidence of a man whose size had always been his primary tool for navigating the world. He was the undisputed king of this canvas castle, his authority reinforced by the volume of his voice and the sheer physical space he displaced. Thorne and his coterie of subordinate Marines moved through the gym like a weather system, a localized area of high pressure that forced others to alter their paths. He stopped by a bench press, adding another 45-pound plate to each side of an already overloaded bar with a theatrical grunt. He was performing strength, not just exercising it. His audience, a half-dozen younger Marines, orbited him, their laughter and affirmations the fuel for his ego. He saw Sharma standing by the bag, her quiet, analytical presence a foreign element in his domain. She was an officer, a lieutenant, which on paper made her his superior. But here, in the temple of iron and sweat, rank was a different currency. Here, he was the authority. Her lack of a Marine Corps uniform, her unassuming build, her silence, it all registered to him as a form of weakness, an affront to the established order of his world. He strode over to her, his boots making heavy, deliberate impacts on the rubber mats. His shadow fell over her, a calculated act of physical intimidation. "Something interesting about that bag, Lieutenant?" he asked, his tone a slick veneer of respect over a solid core of condescension. He pronounced lieutenant as if it were a delicate, amusing word. His followers chuckled on cue, a well-rehearsed chorus. Sharma's gaze shifted from the bag to the man. The transition was fluid, without surprise or alarm. Her eyes scanned him with the same dispassionate intensity she had given the inanimate object. She registered his biometrics instantly. Height, approximately 6 feet, 4 inches. Weight, estimated at 280 pounds, with a body fat percentage between 25 and 30. His stance was wide, rooted, but unbalanced, favoring his right side. His breathing was shallow, an indicator of poor cardiovascular conditioning. The muscles in his shoulders and chest were well developed from years of bench pressing, but his core was soft, a structural weakness. She saw the slight tremor in his left hand, the faint sheen of sweat on his upper lip that spoke of elevated cortisol levels. He was an engine running hot, powerful but inefficient and prone to overheating. She offered no verbal response for 3 full seconds. The silence stretched, becoming a space that he felt compelled to fill. His smirk tightened. "Cat got your tongue, ma'am? Don't worry, we can show you how it's done. This is a Marine gym. We go hard here." He gestured around the tent, a king displaying his realm. Not like you Navy folk sitting on your ships playing grab ass. The insult was crude, generic, and delivered for the benefit of his audience, who responded with another round of appreciative laughter. Sharma finally spoke. Her voice was low, calm, and utterly devoid of inflection. It did not carry far, forcing those nearby to lean in slightly, to quiet themselves to hear. This unintentional effect immediately shifted the room's acoustic dynamics. I was analyzing stress points, she said. It was a simple, factual statement. Thorne blinked. It was not the answer he expected. He had anticipated a defense, an excuse, perhaps a timid retreat. This clinical, almost academic response disarmed his social momentum. Stress points, he scoffed, recovering quickly. Lady, it's a bag. You hit it. Hard. That's the only point that matters. He punctuated his statement by driving his own ham-like fist into the bag next to the one she had been observing. The impact was thunderous. The bag leaped on its chain, a violent, uncontrolled spasm. The sound echoed in the tent, a raw display of brute force. Thorne shook his hand out, wincing slightly, a micro-expression she registered and filed away. He had struck it improperly, a glancing blow with the wrong knuckles, sending a shockwave up his arm. He had hurt himself to make a point. Another data point. He valued appearance over efficacy. The public challenge was inevitable. It was the next logical step in his script of dominance. He turned his full attention back to her, his voice booming again, re-establishing his control over the room's atmosphere. You know, Lieutenant, we got a saying in the Corps: lead, follow, or get out of the way. You don't look like you're doing much leading. He gestured towards the makeshift boxing ring in the center of the gym, a square of mats surrounded by thick, sagging ropes. How about a little lesson, a friendly spar? I'll teach you how a real warrior trains, show you how to put some Marine Corps behind your punches. The invitation hung in the thick, humid air. It was not an invitation. It was a threat wrapped in the language of training. Every Marine in the tent knew what it was. It was a public humiliation ritual, a way for the gunnery sergeant to assert his dominance over an officer who was an outsider, a woman, and physically unimposing. It was a challenge she could not refuse without losing face, and could not accept without inviting a physical beating. From Thorne's perspective, it was a perfect trap. He stood there, arms crossed over his massive chest, a predator who had cornered his prey, savoring the moment. Corporal Davis, a young Marine who had been quietly working the speed bag, stopped his rhythm. He watched the scene with a growing sense of unease. He had seen the gunny do this before, usually to some new private who showed a little too much swagger. But this was different. There was something in the lieutenant's stillness that didn't fit the role of a victim. It wasn't fear. It was patience. He looked from Thorne's belligerent posture to Sharma's calm, centered stance. It was like looking at a roaring bonfire and a shard of dry ice. One was all noise and chaotic energy. The other was silent, contained, and dangerously cold. Sharma's analytical process continued, uninterrupted by the social pressure. The challenge was not a surprise. It was a predictable outcome based on the subject's psychological profile. Insecurity masked by aggression, a need for public validation, and a reliance on physical intimidation. She ran the probabilities. Refusal would be interpreted as weakness and would complicate her primary mission on the FOB, which required a degree of cooperation from the enlisted ranks. Acceptance carried a physical risk, but it also offered an opportunity. an opportunity for a much more efficient and permanent form of communication. A demonstration. She met his gaze. Her expression was unreadable. It was not a mask of neutrality. It was a genuine absence of the emotional static that clouded most human interactions. "Okay," she said. The single word was a pebble dropped into a silent pool. It was so quiet, so devoid of hesitation or bravado, that it seemed to stun Thorne for a moment. He had expected protests, appeals to rank, excuses. He had a dozen dismissive retorts prepared. "Okay" was not on the list. It was a simple, declarative acceptance of his terms. The sheer anticlimax of it infuriated him more than any argument could have. It was as if she was agreeing to a request to pass the salt, not to a public beatdown. A slow, ugly grin spread across Thorne's face. He had mistaken her calm for surrender. "All right then, Lieutenant, let's get you some gloves." He turned to one of his lackeys. "Find her the smallest pair we got. Wouldn't want her to sprain those delicate little wrists." The men laughed, the tension breaking into a kind of feverish excitement. The afternoon's entertainment had been secured. They began to drift towards the ring, forming a loose, expectant circle. The routine sounds of the gym died out, replaced by a low murmur of anticipation. Someone handed Sharma a pair of worn 16-ounce boxing gloves. The leather was cracked, and they smelled of stale sweat. She took them without a word and began to put them on. She didn't bother with hand wraps. That, too, was a message, though no one there was equipped to read it. Hand wraps were for protecting the hands during a prolonged series of high-impact strikes. She did not anticipate the encounter would be prolonged, nor would it be defined by high-impact strikes. She cinched the Velcro straps, the ripping sound loud in the relative quiet. The gloves were absurdly large on her small hands, making her look even more like a lamb being led to slaughter. Thorne, meanwhile, made a show of his own preparations. He stripped off his t-shirt, revealing a torso that was a testament to his lifestyle. Thick slabs of muscle on his chest and arms overlaid a core that had long since lost its definition. He stretched dramatically, his movements large and performative, designed to emphasize his size and power. He barked at a private to get him his lucky gloves, a pair of battered red gloves that looked like they had been through a war. He was building the moment, milking it for all its theatrical potential. He was the gladiator, and she was the sacrifice. As Sharma stepped through the ropes into the makeshift ring, the world seemed to contract. The ring was her laboratory now. The murmuring crowd, the oppressive heat, the smell of canvas and sweat. It all faded into background noise. Her focus narrowed to a single data stream, the man opposite her. He bounced on the balls of his feet, a clumsy imitation of a boxer's rhythm. The movement was inefficient. His mass was poorly distributed, his feet too far apart, creating a stable but immobile base. His breathing was already audible. He was burning energy before the first move had even been made. The crisis began not with a bell, but with a nod from Thorne. He lunged forward, a freight train attempting to derail a scalpel. His strategy was simple, primal: overwhelm her with sheer force and aggression. He threw a looping right hand, a haymaker that started somewhere near his hip. It was a punch designed to end the fight before it began, a show of devastating power for the audience. To the Marines watching, it was a terrifyingly fast explosion of violence. To Sharma, it was a study in slow motion. Her mind processed the attack not as a single event, but as a sequence of cascading data points. She saw the telegraph of the punch in the tensing of his trapezius muscle. She saw the shift of his weight to his back foot, a clear indicator of a power shot. She tracked the arc of his fist, a predictable, inefficient curve that sacrificed speed for perceived momentum. She calculated the trajectory, the velocity, and the precise point in space and time where the punch would arrive. It was telegraphed, sloppy, a weapon of pure anger with no guidance system. She did not retreat. She did not block. She moved. It was not a step, but a fractional shift of her center of gravity, a slight pivot on the ball of her left foot. Her head moved perhaps 4 inches to the right. The wind from Thorne's glove, a gale of displaced air, roared past her ear. The force of the missed punch pulled him off balance, his momentum carrying him forward into the empty space where she had been a microsecond before. He stumbled, his carefully constructed edifice of intimidation cracking with the first failed attack. The crowd let out a collective gasp, a mixture of surprise and thwarted expectation. Thorne's orthodoxy was brute force. His entire tactical doctrine was based on the principle that more mass and more power would invariably win. He had never encountered a problem that he believed could not be solved by hitting it harder. Now, standing in the center of the ring, having punched nothing but air, he was faced with a catastrophic system failure. His primary weapon had not only missed, but had been used against him, compromising his stability. A flicker of confusion, quickly replaced by a surge of red-faced anger, crossed his face. He had expected her to cower, to block, to absorb the punishment. He had not expected her to simply not be there. He reset, shaking his head as if to clear a fog. He abandoned the single power shots and adopted what he thought was a more technical approach. He began throwing a clumsy combination, a left jab followed by another wild right cross. The jab was a slow, pawing motion, lacking the snap and recoil of a proper jab. It was an arm punch with no hip rotation, no kinetic chain. The right cross was another telegraphed power shot, born of frustration. His established protocol was failing, and his only response was to apply it with more vigor, a common but fatal error. For a full minute, this pattern repeated. Thorne would advance, throwing heavy, poorly constructed punches. Sharma would respond with minute, almost imperceptible movements. A slip here, a bob there, a slight angling of her body. She was a ghost in the machine, present but intangible. She did not waste a single joule of energy on unnecessary motion. Her defense was a masterclass in efficiency, a physical manifestation of pure logic. She was not just dodging, she was gathering data. With every missed punch, she mapped his reaction time, his recovery posture, his shifting balance, the rhythm of his breathing. She was building a complete diagnostic profile of her opponent's mechanical and psychological systems. The initial file she'd built in her mind was being populated with terabytes of real-time combat data. He was showing her every flaw, every weakness, every predictable pattern in his code. The moment of the turn was not a dramatic reversal. It was a quiet, deliberate shift in the flow of the battle. It was the moment she decided her data collection was complete. Thorne, gasping for air, his face slick with sweat, lunged forward again, throwing a desperate looping hook. He was tired, frustrated, and his technique had degraded from clumsy to non-existent. He was fighting her memory, swinging at spots she had already vacated. This time, she did not simply evade. As the punch sailed past her head, she flowed with his movement, stepping into the vacuum his momentum had created. She was now inside his guard, too close for him to swing his heavy arms effectively. For the first time, she initiated contact, but it was not a punch. She did not seize command with a shout or a gesture. Her authority became an undeniable physical law. The space, the timing, the very air in the ring now belonged to her. Her movements, once purely defensive, became calm, precise, and devastatingly offensive. They were not the actions of a brawler, but the deliberate economical motions of a surgeon. The first point of contact was her left hand, open, striking the brachial plexus nerve cluster on the side of his neck. The strike was not powerful in the conventional sense. It was precise. It was a focused application of physics, a specific amount of force delivered to a specific nerve bundle. To the observers, it looked like a light tap. To Thorne, it was a bolt of lightning. His entire right arm went numb, a dead weight hanging uselessly at his side. A look of profound, bewildered shock spread across his face. He had been hit, but it did not feel like a punch. It felt like a part of his body had just been switched off. The crowd, which had been shouting encouragement for Thorne, fell silent. The raw, primal energy of the anticipated beatdown had vanished, replaced by a tense, confused quiet. Corporal Davis, standing at the edge of the ring, leaned forward, his eyes wide. He was the first to truly comprehend what he was seeing. This was not a fight. It was a dissection. He saw the other Marines exchange nervous glances. Their allegiance, their certainty, was beginning to fracture. They had come to see a foregone conclusion, and instead they were witnessing the systematic dismantling of their champion. Their focus shifted from Thorne's aggression to Sharma's chilling efficiency. They were no longer watching a Marine. They were watching her. Before Thorne could process the failure of his right arm, she had already moved to the next step in her sequence. His forward momentum was still carrying him, a rudderless ship. She used it. Her right foot slid behind his left ankle, a subtle, almost invisible movement. At the same time, her right forearm pressed against his collarbone. It was not a shove. It was a guide. She was not fighting his mass. She was redirecting it, exploiting the fundamental weakness in his stance that she had identified before the fight even began. He was a 280-pound man, but his center of gravity was now hopelessly compromised. His own weight became his enemy. He tumbled not with the clean fall of a swept fighter, but with the clumsy, collapsing gracelessness of a felled tree. He hit the mat with a heavy percussive thud that shook the entire ring. The sound was a full stop, the end of a sentence that had been shouted for far too long. He landed on his side, the air driven from his lungs in a pained, wheezing gasp. His useless right arm was pinned awkwardly beneath him. The solution was elegant, a triumph of intellect over brute force. It was a checkmate delivered in 2 moves. Sharma had executed her plan flawlessly, using her deep, almost preternatural understanding of biomechanics and human physiology. She had not beaten him. She had solved him, like a complex physics problem. She stood over him, not in a triumphant pose, but with the detached calm of a scientist observing the result of an experiment. Her breathing was steady, her expression unchanged. The contrast between her absolute composure and Thorne's gasping, incapacitated form on the mat was stark and absolute. The threat was neutralized, not just the physical threat of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, but the ideological threat he represented, the belief that might makes right, that volume equals authority, that tradition is a substitute for competence. In the profound silence that followed his fall, a new reality began to settle over the assembled Marines. They had just witnessed their entire power structure, the very foundation of their social hierarchy in this small world, be inverted by a quiet woman they had dismissed as a lightweight. The air in the tent, once thick with aggressive testosterone, was now thin and cold with awe. It was the silence of a paradigm shift. Thorne pushed himself up onto one elbow, his face a mask of pain, humiliation, and disbelief. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw breath. "Cheap shot," he rasped, the words choked with dust and broken pride. "You cheap shot." It was the last desperate defense of a shattered ego, an attempt to reframe his utter demolition as a failure of her character rather than his ability. "My movements were direct and efficient," Sharma stated, her voice as clinical as ever. "Your defense was inadequate." There was no malice in her words, no triumph. It was a simple, factual assessment, which made it all the more devastating. The flaps of the tent were thrown open, casting a harsh, rectangular block of sunlight into the dim interior. 3 figures were silhouetted against the bright desert glare. As they stepped inside, the silhouettes resolved into Colonel Vance, the FOB commander, and his 2 senior NCOs. Vance was a tall, lean man in his late 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak. His eyes, pale and sharp, took in the scene in an instant. The silent circle of Marines, Thorne on the floor, and Sharma standing calmly in the center of the ring. His expression was a thundercloud. He strode to the edge of the ring, his boots silent on the dusty floor. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence alone commanded a suffocating authority that made Thorne's previous bluster seem childish. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice quiet and laced with ice. "Get on your feet." Thorne struggled, using his one good arm to push himself into a sitting position, then shakily to his knees, and finally, with a groan, to his feet. He stood before the colonel, swaying slightly, his chest still heaving. He avoided Vance's gaze, staring at the mat. The fall from power was swift, total, and brutally public. One moment he was the king of his domain. The next, he was a disgraced subordinate being called to account. "Care to explain to me," Colonel Vance continued, his voice dangerously soft, "why you felt it was an appropriate use of your time to assault a visiting officer from Naval Special Warfare?" The words "Naval Special Warfare" dropped into the silence like a grenade. A wave of comprehension and shock washed over the faces of the watching Marines. Navy, SEAL. The quiet, unassuming woman was not just some random lieutenant from a supply ship. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her impossible calm, her unnerving stillness, the surgical precision of her movements. They had not just been watching a fighter, they had been watching one of the most highly trained combat operatives on the planet. Corporal Davis closed his eyes for a second, a silent "of course" forming on his lips. It was the only explanation that made sense. Thorne's head snapped up, his face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. He looked from the colonel to Sharma, as if seeing her for the first time. "Sir, we were just sparring, sir." "It did not look like sparring to me, Gunny," Vance said, his eyes narrowing. "It looked like you, a 280-pound man, attempting to injure an officer who is on my base, under my protection, to perform a critical mission analysis. Lieutenant Sharma is here as my guest. She is the lead instructor for the Tier 1 Close Quarters Combat Directive. Her purpose here is to evaluate the combat readiness of my units, from the ground up." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You, gunnery sergeant, have just provided her with her first and most vivid diagnostic. You have demonstrated a failure in leadership, a lack of discipline, and a profound misunderstanding of what constitutes a warrior. You are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Sergeant Major will escort you to your quarters. You are confined there until further notice. Pack your things. The revelation was the final crushing blow. Thorne's humiliation was now complete. He had not just picked a fight with a superior operator. He had, in his arrogance, perfectly embodied the very problem she was here to identify and fix. He was the disease presenting its own symptoms for diagnosis. He stood there, speechless, his one good arm hanging limp, the other now trembling. The sergeant major, a man with a face like granite, stepped forward, took Thorne by his good arm, and led him away without a word. The disgraced gunnery sergeant did not look back. A new order descended upon the gym. The silence that remained was different. It was not the silence of shock, but of respect. A deep, abiding respect born from a demonstration of undeniable, lethal competence. Colonel Vance turned his attention to Sharma, his expression softening slightly. "My apologies for my subordinate's behavior, Lieutenant. I trust you are unharmed." "I am fine, Colonel," Sharma replied, her tone unchanged. The data was useful. She was already unstrapping the oversized gloves. The experiment was over. The results had been logged. It was time to move on to the next task. In the days that followed, the culture of Fob Erebus shifted. The loud, performative masculinity championed by Thorne vanished, replaced by a quieter, more focused professionalism. The gym became a place of serious training, not posturing. Lieutenant Sharma became a ghost, a legend whispered about in chow lines and after-action briefings. She was rarely seen, but her presence was felt everywhere. Marines trained with a new intensity, a new humility, as if they knew they were being watched, being measured against a standard they had only just begun to comprehend. A week later, Sharma was in the gym late at night, long after everyone else had gone. She was working on the heavy bag, not with the explosive violence of a brawler, but with the precise, rhythmic impacts of a master craftsman. Each strike landed with a sharp, clean thwack, each one perfectly placed, each one a study in the flawless transfer of kinetic energy from her core, through her hips, and out through her knuckles. She was not training, she was meditating. A figure appeared in the entrance of the tent, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. It was Corporal Davis. He held 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling from them in the cool night air. He approached her quietly, his nervousness palpable. He did not speak until she stopped and turned to look at him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, I brought you some coffee. Figured you might be working late." He offered one of the mugs to her. It was a simple gesture, but it was freighted with meaning. It was not the act of a subordinate trying to curry favor with an officer. It was a gesture of respect from one professional to another. It was the quiet acknowledgement that signified the true victory, the lasting cultural shift she had engineered. Sharma took the mug, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. She looked at the young corporal. She saw in his eyes not fear, but a genuine, burning curiosity, a desire to learn. "Thank you, Corporal," she said. Davis hesitated, then took a breath. "Ma'am, that move you used, the one with your foot, the sweep, you didn't use force. You used his own weight. I've been trying to figure it out in my head. The leverage, the angle. How did you know the exact point where his balance would break?" He was not asking for praise or a story. He was asking for knowledge. He wanted to understand the physics of what he had witnessed. A rare, almost imperceptible softening occurred in Sharma's expression. She took a sip of the coffee. "Balance is not a state," she began, her voice taking on the quiet authority of a teacher. "It is a negotiation with gravity." He had already lost the negotiation before he ever threw a punch. I just pointed it out to him. She then turned back to the bag. "Show me your stance, Corporal." For the next hour, under the single, humming light in the empty gym, the master instructor taught her first willing student on FOB Erebus. Her work was eventually done. The full report was filed, the unit's deficiencies catalogued, and the remedial training protocols designed. She departed FOB Erebus as quietly as she had arrived, a lone figure boarding a C-130 in the pre-dawn darkness. She left no friends, no personal mementos. She left only a lesson, etched into the institutional memory of the men stationed there. She had come to a place ruled by the gravity of ego and brute force, a world of loud noises and empty threats. She had not conquered it. She had simply introduced a new, more fundamental law, the law of competence. And like gravity itself, it was silent, inexorable, and it bent everything to its will. The legend of the quiet lieutenant who dismantled a mountain remained, a cautionary tale and a new standard, long after the dust of her departure had settled back onto the scorched earth.